Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to attend the conference on the future of United Nations. As a student of O.P. Jindal Global University and a member of the Center for the Study of United Nations, allow me to extend a very warm welcome to all the guests present with us here today. I request everyone in the audience to please switch off their mobile phones or put them on silent mode for the entire duration of the event. Thank you. We are now ready to start the event. In today's agenda, we had Ambassador Mr. Kamlesh Sharma delivering the special address. Unfortunately, he has been taken ill today and will not be joining us today. Now, may I please welcome our Vice Chancellor, Dr. C. Rajkumar, to deliver the opening remarks.
Very good morning to all of you. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to this very important conference on the future of the United Nations. Arguably, this conference could have been organized at any point of time, but I do believe that this is a very special moment, and I'll come back to it in a minute. But let me first take this opportunity to heartily welcome our distinguished speakers as guests of honor, starting with Ambassador Sukihiro Hasegawa, the President of the Global Peacebuilding Association of Japan, former Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Timor-Leste, and also Director, Academic Exchange and Cooperation, UN Association of Japan, for accepting our invitation to deliver the keynote address. I also would like to take this opportunity to welcome my mentor and a very dear friend of the university, and a very distinguished individual who has made significant contributions towards strengthening of the United Nations and the ideas and the ideals and the aspirations of the UN, both internationally and within India. I would like to extend this welcome to Mr. Virendra Dayal, who is amidst us, who used to be working very closely with a number of Secretary Generals in the past, and later also served with distinction as a member of the National Human Rights Commission in India. The theme of this conference obviously is quite central to, I believe, what many of us believe in the context of creating collective consciousness for humanity. The United Nations as an institution stands tall in protecting that ideal. I'm very happy that the Jindal School of International Affairs and the students of the Jindal School of International Affairs who are all present here, both from the BA Global Affairs program and the Masters in Diplomacy, Law and Business program, are participating in this conference. I do believe that this entire day's proceedings, starting with the inaugural session and the first thematic session looking at multilateralism, the second thematic session looking at assessing the work of the United Nations from the past, and the third thematic session looking at the future of the UN specifically, and followed by the Valedictory session, are being attended and contributed as panelists by very distinguished individuals who have spent a lifetime thinking about these issues and working on these issues. It has a very healthy mix of people who come from academia and the world of practice, and I'm very delighted that students across different schools, including possibly the Public Policy School, the Law School, the Liberal Arts School, and other schools of the university, are also attending the day-long proceedings. Speaking about the future of the UN, I will say that this conference obviously has a bias in favor of the fact that the United Nations as an institution need to be strengthened. It is not a conference titled The Future of the UN with, let's say, skeptics questioning that it is, the UN is, let's say, a dying institution, and we just have to figure out how do we commit a euthanasia on the United Nations. That's not what this conference is about. This conference is really about recognizing that the future, it is in the future of the United Nations lies all our futures. It is in the future of the United Nations that all our collective aspirations and goals of humanity rest. It is in the future of the United Nations that individual countries, constitutions, and their own commitment to the rule of law and democracy, as well as values of justice, lies. It is in the future of the United Nations that our ability to work together as a humanity, addressing the most pressing problems of humanity, it is in the future of the UN that we could come together as individuals, as individual nations, addressing the most difficult issues that are faced by humanity, and in that process, developing greater respect for each other and greater understanding of each other. One of the big challenges that we are facing today in the world is a significant deterioration in relation to basic trust between nations, but also between people who exercise powers and the people who are governed. This lack of trust is not only at the international level, but also at the domestic level. And the lack of trust has also questioned the potential of democratic institutions, including intergovernmental organizations, which to what extent they can deliver on the promise, to what extent they can fulfill the ideals and aspirations that establish these institutions in the first place. This internal and existential challenge that has been posed to the United Nations as an institution need to be addressed in a very deliberate, in a very conscious, and in a very comprehensive manner. And a number of stakeholders are important in this. In fact, there are studies that have been undertaken in different parts of the world, including in India, and the level of skepticism among young people about the United Nations as an institution is quite high. That does not mean that people would like the UN to be ineffective or, for that matter, to be undermined, but there is a constant struggle with the United Nations about its gap between the rhetoric of the UN as an institution and the reality of its role and responsibilities and its ability to fulfill its promise. Now, of course, we in India are pretty familiar with this widening gap. As a lawyer, I am always in a dilemma when I teach my students at the law school, occasionally when I do take courses. How do you instill faith in the rule of law in a country where laws are constantly violated? How do you instill faith in the rule of law when laws are not only violated, but they are violated with impunity? This dilemma of a lawyer, of a law professor, particularly in developing countries of the world where the internal mechanisms that are expected to protect the rule of law are constantly under challenge and under threat. We need to elevate the level of consciousness, and we start making the distinction between the is and the ought propositions of law. We constantly think in terms of what ought to be the case and what isn't. I remember very vividly that in the year 2000, the UNDP published a report on human rights and development as the theme. And that report had Professor Amartya Sen writing about the relationship between human rights and development. And he very beautifully talked about the dilemma of economists and lawyers on the one hand, and how they both try to deal with issues surrounding human rights and development. The economists are looking at specific deliverables when it comes to creating rights, and lawyers are looking at to what extent those rights could be actually enforced. And so what Amartya Sen so beautifully summarized towards that end of that introductory chapter is that rights have inherent existence even if they don't get enforced. If rights don't get enforced, that doesn't mean those rights don't exist. It's just that they remain as unfulfilled rights. And it is the responsibility of the society to move towards fulfillment of those rights. Somewhere in that framework, we need to find answers. We need to find answers relating to the lack of enforcement of the rule of law, both domestically and internationally. We need to find answers in relation to how countries at times violate human rights with impunity, and how do we still believe in the cause of international justice? To what extent our effort to achieve international justice through the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and of course the International Criminal Court. All these institutions, to what extent they ought to be involved in the effort to achieve justice. In some ways, how do they work towards protecting and promoting the legitimacy of the United Nations as an institution. So this conference, in many ways, expects to discuss many of these issues, obviously, consciously keeping in mind Brexit and at times even the rhetoric that emanates out of the United States. To what extent large powers have a role and responsibility, and to what extent the developing countries, including countries in the BRICS region, India and China, but Brazil and Russia and South Africa, to what extent these new economies are able to or should be shaping the future of the United Nations as an institution. Unfortunately, just as it is in sort of domestic law or domestic practice of nations, international law is also shaped by how nations behave and how they conduct themselves as much as what they say. Regardless of what the rhetoric is, people will believe how you act when situations arise, not necessarily what to say. And this aspect of seeing and believing and indeed, adhering to the state practice is something which we as thinking individuals need to address. Have we reached a stage where the level of distrust in institutions, particularly international institutions, has reached a point where they are slowly becoming, let's say, less relevant? Or, even worse, are they becoming institutions that are used and abused for individual pursuits, political and other types of vested interests that are sort of marring the future of these institutions? In a way, we need to address both the internal and external challenges faced by United Nations as an institution. With those words, I would like to once again thank my colleague, Professor Vasilin Popovsky, Professor Sudarshan, the Dean of our Public Policy School, Professor Sridhar Patnaik, the Chief Proctor of the University, Professor Murthy, the Registrar and the Center for Human Rights Studies Director, Professor Gudmundur and other individuals, including Professor Mohan Kumar and Dr. Sriram Chaulia, the Dean of the School of International Affairs, and many other faculty members who contributed to the organization of this conference. We are very delighted that we are able to host this conference at a time when many of these institutions are facing a deep crisis, and it is important that conversations that are more nuanced, that are more meaningful, and that are more sophisticated can take place in an academic setting, and we hope that that is exactly what this conference will be able to do. With those words, I would like to once again extend a warm welcome to Ambassador Hasegawa and Mr. Virendra Dayal for their presence in the inaugural session. Thank you very much.
I would now like to invite Dr. Vasilin Popovsky to deliver the introductory remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Well, let me return the favor and thank the Vice Chancellor Raj Kumar for giving us this excellent opportunity, and all his team worked very hard to make this event, and we are very pleased with not only organizationally but also intellectually. He was behind the designing of the panel with his inspiration, energy and enthusiasm. Thank you very much, Dr. Hasegawa, for making all the trip out of Japan to be with us today and to address the topic, Future of United Nations. Thank you very much, Virendra Dayal, also for joining us for your inaugural address. As Vice Chancellor said, the future of the United Nations is quite a provocative topic. And to be honest, in all my academic career, I always avoided to take any project which includes the word future. I always thought of future as something totally unscientific, something very speculative. What can we say in a time of uncertainty? In fact, 10 years ago, working for the United Nations University, Richard Falk approached me asking me to revise his previous project in 1970s about the study of the future world. He published such a book in 1975, Study of Future Worlds. And I was very skeptical. I said, Richard, no way. Let's have another project. Let's not talk about future. It will be a disaster. In fact, he admitted that talking about future can be a disaster. His project in 1970s couldn't even think of events such as 1989, end of communism, of 9/11, and so on. Often we face such uncertainty, and actually that uncertainty is even higher today than 100 or 200 years ago. If we think of the rapid changes, technological, biotechnological, mega data, and so on, it's very difficult to predict anything, even tomorrow. Somebody living in 200 years ago, in 1819, would probably very much have a clear idea what will happen in the next 10 or 20 years. And similarly, something living in 1919, the time when the League of Nations was established, would have a very clear idea what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. We, today in 2019, have absolutely no idea what the world will be in 2029. Because of the speed of change, because of the dynamism of the current human development, but also technological development. In other words, to talk about the future of the United Nations or of anything else has somehow a dual meaning. As the Vice Chancellor said, on one hand, this is the idea of what we want the future to be. Well, what do we want the United Nations to be? What is our future vision, where the world should go? What are the norms and rules we want to continue to maintain? But also the other future will be the future of the reality. So we have a future of imagination and future of reality. And if we look at the United Nations history, it has been always this battle between the two. If we look at the UN Charter and its preamble, it starts with very visionary and imaginations about a world of peace and human rights and rule of law. It starts with we the people, expecting people to be driving force in international relations. But we see later in the same UN Charter a very realistic assessment that it will be still the power of the states, not of people. It will be actually the power of 5 big states possessing nuclear weapons that will be the main actor in when it comes to security. So the Charter itself is a combination of those two futures. On one hand, the inspiration and the vision and the desire of everyone what the future should be, and on another hand, the future of the reality. And that has been actually addressed by several Secretary Generals. Remember Dag Hammarskjöld, who famously said that we should not over-expect from United Nations. It has not the purpose to make us live in the heaven. The purpose should be much more limited. The purpose of the UN is to save us from going to hell, not to live in heaven. Similarly, the previous Secretary General, Trygve Lie, when he invited Dag Hammarskjöld at the airport in New York, coming to take the office, and his first expression was to Hammarskjöld was, "Please welcome to the most impossible job in the world." He already realized that what Secretary General can do is very little in a time when the Cold War started and East and West disagreed on most of the issues. In other words, we have an interesting, provocative topic. I wouldn't say impossible. Somehow the future is interesting in a sense of that unpredictability and uncertainty. In fact, 2 years ago, a French professor, Guimard Kleber, asked me to write a chapter in his book on the future of international law. I immediately rejected and said, "Leave me alone, no way, I cannot do that. I don't want to touch the topic of future." But he was very persistent, and at the end of the day, I ended up writing that chapter on the future of international law, and I enjoyed it. In a sense, I was also very much inspired by Yuval Harari and his book Homo Deus, and not only looking in the future in a sense of SDGs and Agenda 2030, but also long-term future, what the world will be in the 22nd century. In other words, I'm extremely honored and thankful to the Vice Chancellor, to Hasegawa and Dial for coming today and addressing this topic. There was a famous proverb by the Indian Americans that knowledge is attached to the past and wisdom belongs to the future. And with men and women of wisdom today, I'm fascinated to hear later our discussions on what the future of the nations will be. Thank you very much.
For our next speech, I would like to request Mr. Virendra Dayal, who is the former chef de cabinet to the UN Secretary General, to deliver the inaugural address. Thank you.
Thank you so much for asking me to give the inaugural talk this morning. I'm grateful to you for your introduction. Professor Hasegawa, pleasure to share the dais with you. And thank you, Dr. Pawlowski, for your opening comments. Well, distinguished members of the faculty, and most of all, my young friends, you've taken a great risk in asking an 84-year-old man to talk about the future, since my knowledge of the UN is largely of the past, and it's 27 years since I came home. The problem with octogenarians is they've forgotten most of what they knew. But the funny thing is, they remember with increasing certitude things which never happened. And I found this to be true of the memoirs of many of my colleagues who've retired and decided to write about themselves. One of the funniest stories is about my very dear friend and my mentor, Sir Brian Urquhart, to many of us, the great peacekeeper of the United Nations. But Brian is going to be 100 years old next week, on the 28th of this month, 8 days from now. But when he was a young man, in 1961, serving the UN in the Congo, he was one fine evening taken captive by a bunch of absolutely drunk and disorderly Katangese troops who decided to beat him without any good reason to an inch of death. This is a rather sad occasion. But a colleague of Brian's, who remained comparatively unscathed when writing his autobiography, appropriated the story about Brian for himself, making himself the hero of great exploits in the UN, with which he'd had very little to do. Anyhow, that's how life is. Now, I must start with a confession, really. It's where I stand. Despite the vicissitudes of 73 years and the open hostility to multilateralism these days in leadership circles, which I won't mention for reasons of politeness, the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights remain, in my mind, and I hope in many others, among the great secular documents of human history. I still have an unshakable belief in the values they espouse and the relevance of the organization, particularly in troubled times. Both of these instruments were born of the unspeakable tragedies of the 20th century, a century which was the bloodiest in human history. It saw 120 million people killed in acts of war, another 100 million people killed for reasons of race, religion, language, or membership of particular social or political groups. And it saw tens of millions of refugees fleeing persecution. These realities have haunted me all my life and conditioned my thinking on many matters, including the future, the present, and the future of the United Nations. Now, both of these great instruments were actually conceived devised and written by statesmen and stateswomen of the highest stature, who in their own lifetimes had seen the scourge of war and the follies and the brutalities of unrestrained and competing nationalisms that led to these catastrophes. I therefore find the contrast to some of the leaders of today who have no such experience and seem to be suffering from amnesia when it comes to history, I find it very disturbing. If every nation said, "Me first," we'll soon be shoveling each other's graves and the grave of the planet as well. Now, what is the state? What is the state of the world that the UN is trying to serve these days? I think the present Secretary General, who's an extremely able and cultured man, Antonio Guterres, he felt compelled to say, just last month, the General Assembly, he had to ring, and he said he was going to ring a bell of alarm, and he said, without mincing his words, in great honesty, he said, "We face a world in trouble." How deep is the trouble? Well, here are some of the problems. Armed conflicts are raging. Terrorism is threatening millions of people. Forced displacement is at record levels. Poverty is not eradicated. Hunger is growing. Inequality is rising. And climate change is posing an existential threat to the planet. Further, we all know there are disputes over trade, which are not being resolved as they should be. There's sky-high debt, and the rule of law and human rights, to which the Vice-Chancellor just referred, is really embattled. Civil society, its space is being restricted in more and more countries. A great tragedy, since the UN needs civil society and the world needs the voice of the people of the world. Media is under threat. Hate speech and hate crimes compounding this toxic atmosphere in which we are. On top of that, we have proximate to us, it's already started, a fourth industrial revolution. And nobody quite knows where to lead, what will be its consequences. And it's adding to the unease which people are feeling in different ways at different levels of society and different ways in different countries. It's not surprising, with so many problems at home and abroad, it's not surprising that there's a growing distrust, as our Vice-Chancellor just said, of the instruments of government, at the local level, at the national level, and at the international level, including as far as the UN is concerned. We have to be aware of the reality if we're going to deal with it. So the question then is, does the UN system need reform? To my mind, while staying true to its principles, it certainly does. It certainly does. And its responses must be commensurate with the tasks and the realities that it faces. There's no point living in some quixotic world of make-believe. But I dare say the situation no less requires radical reform in the conduct of member states who comprise the UN. So this subject remains largely taboo. For while every government has ideas on how to reform the UN, few governments examine with any enthusiasm or any degree of honesty whether or not they abide by their own obligations under the Charter and their treaty obligations. And if I may say so, this has been a persistent irony that the UN has faced since 1945. This is the elephant in the room that nobody is prepared to see, except, of course, when it comes to blaming each other. Reform is therefore not an easy task, particularly at a time when the permanent 5 members of the Security Council are once again locked in competing visions of the future, and a new equilibrium is yet to emerge that accommodates China's growing power and ambition. The difficulties in fundamental institutional reform are most evident in the stalemate that persists when it comes to the Security Council, with the permanent 5 and their proxies playing a complex game which at the moment is leading precisely nowhere. And it is this that is preventing reform. The arrangements of 1945 are clearly in some ways obsolete and does no good to the UN as an institution or to world peace and security if countries such as India and Japan are denied the seats they deserve by any objective yardstick or criteria. If it's any consolation, however, the UN has weathered numerous storms in the past 73 years, and the demands for UN reform are not new. Instead, in every decade, in the tenure of each Secretary General, it has been essential to introduce reforms to meet the challenges of the time. So the process of reform must be seen as a continuum. Some of the ideas over the years have been excellent, others have been terrible, and some have been unworkable. And they related to all aspects of the work of the UN, to the work of its principal organs, to its policies and practices, and in fact to all of its endeavors. Let me just walk you down memory lane, since after all that's one of the privileges of being 84. The UN Charter did not have any concept of peacekeeping. It had a charter of peace, and it had a concept of peace enforcement under Chapter 7. But in 1949, the Secretariat invented something called peacekeeping, which has proven to be one of the great innovations in the history of the United Nations and of the effort to maintain peace and security in the world. The purpose was at that time to supervise the armistice agreements in the Middle East between the Palestinians and the new state of Israel. And it was mediated by a very great person, Ralph Bunche, who was the first of 11 UN persons or entities to get the Nobel Prize, and whose copy of the Charter I carry in my pocket as a souvenir. It's rather weather-beaten. As you can see, it's well-thumbed and torn, but that's how it is. That's the ravages of time. So peacekeeping was what you would call a brilliant idea. Then in the late 1950s, of course, you remember Khrushchev arrived on the scene, and he banged the table in front of him in the General Assembly Hall with his shoe and wanted the resignation of the great Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld and suggested that there should be a troika guiding the United Nations. No, that was a terrible idea. In the 60s, there was a huge change in the UN and reform when its membership swelled from 51, the original, to really 120 with the decolonization process, and which the UN itself played a leading role in arranging. And this was a different kind of idea. This was a transformative idea. The late 60s and 70s witnessed the sharp division between the North and the South concerning what was then described as a new international order. The debates were divisive, but the UN adapted again through considerable institutional changes to dramatically better serve its new membership. So we had the creation of UNDP in 1965, of the World Food Programme in 63, of the United Nations Environmental Programme, of UNIFEM, of UN population, of the UN Fund for Population Activities, of UN Habitat, and even the UN volunteers. See the evolution. You must see things in continuum. And then on the side of the staff, then we soon had a High Commissioner for Human Rights, and later on, more recently, a Deputy Secretary General. I mention all this because the UN is an organism that's evolving. It's evolving. When I was serving as Chef de Cabinet to the Secretary General, Javier Perez de Cuellar, in his first term, there were demands that the UN reform or perish. And at one stage, a representative of the host country, whose name I won't mention, he said, well, he'd be very happy to see the UN sail into the sunset, and he would be on the shores of the East River to say bye-bye, bye-bye. Well, the UN is still there, and I suppose I say with regret, he has sailed on to another life. But in the same years, the UN demanded that the percentage of its financial contributions be drastically reduced from the 25% at which they were. And a stage was reached where it withheld large contributions, large percentages of contribution, in order to bring the UN to heel, to punish it, even though its own debt had amounted to 500 million and it was in danger of defaulting. Now, this crisis is typical of what the UN had to endure at various times over the years, but it had an ironical, even amusing side to it, because Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar decided, well, publicly he stated, well, if you're unhappy with paying 25%, why don't you pay 17% or 20%? Now, this took the US by surprise, because they wanted to keep a higher percentage and exercise leverage through the withholding of contributions, so they turned down the suggestion. And that's how it was. The crisis was finally sorted out over a lunch in the White House, when I recall the Secretary General saying to President Reagan, Mr. President, will it be said that one legacy of the Reagan administration will be the destruction of what President Roosevelt started? Now, President Reagan had a sense of humor, and he got the point. So he gave an avuncular smile and started a process that led to the restoration of the dues. Colin Powell, who was then National Security Advisor, he made his first trip to the UN as my guest, and we started the process of discussion on how on earth to get the Americans to pay $500 million in which they were in default. Now, in 1992, with the waning of the Cold War, the UN thought a new phase had arrived in its life, and the newly elected Secretary General Boutros Ghali, whom I had the honor to serve for a while, he felt that it was time for a summit meeting of the Security Council, which hadn't been held till then. So on the 31st of January, 1992, the summit meeting was held at the Security Council, and the Secretary was asked to provide ideas on how to reform and improve the capacity of the UN for peacekeeping, peacemaking, and preventive diplomacy. And the Secretary General, a few weeks later, produced a report called An Agenda for Peace, which I was happy to, and honored to help him to write. It was well received at the time, though I have to say that I was once upbraided by a distinguished professor who said, well, your Agenda for Peace has only 86 paragraphs, and my criticism of it has 186 paragraphs. So that's how it goes with the UN. But the euphoria of the reforms dissipated, because before the UN could reorganize itself sufficiently, genocides occurred in Rwanda, with which you are familiar, and Srebrenica, in what was then part of the dissolving Yugoslavia. And it showed once again the fault lines that the UN lives with sometimes. In this case, the fault lines were between the Secretary General and the Security Council. In the first case, in Rwanda, the Secretary General and the Canadian Force Commander begged the Security Council for more troops, only to be told by the American ambassador to get lost. And genocide occurred, which shattered the Canadian Force Commander's morale, and it was a disaster for everybody, to say nothing of those who died. It was the end. And in the case of Srebrenica, again, the fault lines occurred. when the Security Council produced the concept of safe havens, which were more a figment of imagination because they did not give the UN the mandate or the troops to be able to ensure the safe havens remain safe. The poor Dutch contingent that was there witnessed and presided over genocide. These have been painful lessons that have had to be learned, but sometimes, even now, I would say they haven't been sufficiently learned because a gap remains often, too often, between mandates and the means to give those mandates true power and force. And I would say greatly to the credit of my friend Kofi Annan, who was involved in both of these instances in a way that in his time, then he had major studies made of both of these calamities, including his own role in it. And during his time, then the UN came up with another concept, and partly in response to this, Kofi came with the concept of the responsibility to protect. A very fine and noble concept, but unfortunately, like every good idea, it fails in practice because member states use it in ways which are not justified or warranted, using force without due thought and consideration. So disasters occur where they should not. With Secretary Ban Ki-moon, another effort was made at reform on the managerial side, and he took forward Kofi's idea of the Millennium Development Goals, and so we had at the summit meeting the adoption of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, with which I'm sure you're all familiar, and which are now at the heart of an agreed agenda on the economic side between all nations, and all of us have promised to do what we must, including our own country. And we are falling behind, unfortunately. But also, Ban Ki-moon brought to the forefront of the UN's agenda the question of climate change. Climate change, it moved to the center of the global agenda. And I'm happy that in spite of his inability to secure great successes on the political side, he was able to savor the agreement in Paris on climate change, even if now President Trump is choosing to withdraw from that agreement. The path to global understanding, like the path to true love, it never does run smooth, and we must be prepared to take the ups and the downs and remain constant in our objective and our devotion. So I come to the present now, and I'm happy to see that Secretary General Guterres is hard at work to reform the organization in a number of areas. The development sector, the idea of resident coordinators changing, country teams changing, peace and security, new ideas, delegating authorities, trying to improve the regional balances of the staff. And I wish him well, and I wish him well. He set as his priorities climate change, achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and trying to prepare the world for the fourth industrial revolution. But when all is said and done, I look back on my own years at the UN, the greatest reform I would like to see would be this: to achieve the goals of the organization, member states and the Secretariat must serve the Charter with true fidelity. For to serve in the UN in any capacity, it's not a job like any other. It's a calling of a very special kind. And since we are in India and I'm speaking to an Indian audience, it's a kind of a sadhana. It's a spiritual discipline, which I think we should remember. That's what the UN is. And I've witnessed that when the organization succeeds, and I've seen when it has failed. The first term of affairs acquired was very painful. The Security Council was in status, wars raged, the US withheld its contributions, and was out to punish the organization. But Javier, he persevered in spite of the odds. And there was a change in the international climate. Mikhail Gorbachev arrived. and totally helped to transform the international scene. Suddenly, we found a situation in which the Security Council began to work as it should, the Permanent Five. The cooperation with the Secretary General improved. The outreach to other member states became constant. And so you had a string of successes, which I think were perhaps unparalleled in the UN's history. And these included just the Iran-Iraq war was brought to an end in 1988. Withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan was arranged by the Geneva Accords in the same year. The independence of Namibia was obtained in 1989. The peace agreements on Cambodia were reached in 1991. There was a successful arrangement on the peace front in Central America, and the El Salvador's agreements were signed on the last day of Javier's presence in office. Now, I mention this because it shows what can be done if the organization works as it's meant to. Then the sky is the limit. And if they don't, nothing happens. And I contrast this now to the way in which the UN has stumbled and been unable, really, to effect either the crisis that has taken so many lives in Syria, or to deal with the consequences of the disastrous Second Gulf War. I'll now conclude, because I shouldn't overspeak. I'd like to conclude with the words of Dag Hammarskjöld, for whom I have great respect. He was the second Secretary General of the UN, and he was a true karma yogi, as we say in our country, a true karma yogi. I turned to him for comfort and counsel. Hammarskjöld said, "The pursuit of peace and progress cannot be ended in a few years, either in victory or defeat. The pursuit of peace, with its trials and errors, its successes and setbacks, can never be relaxed and can never be abandoned." And he warned us, our work for peace must begin in the private world of each of us. For to build a world without fear, we must be without fear. And to build a world of justice, we must be just. In the end, he said, the road to holiness necessarily passes through the world of action, and I commend Hammarskjöld's words to you, my young friends. Thank you.